Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Colorful Profiles, our 4-week journey, exploring short stories of extraordinary and unexpected characters from Jewish history. Today we will be doing lesson 2, which is titled Influential Jews. And today's lesson is co-sponsored by Elise Iser and Joyce Wee, who's here with us tonight. Thank you, Joyce and Elise. And we are going to be picking up our conversation where we left off last week. Last week, I introduced you to 3 characters. Perhaps I didn't introduce you to them, but definitely you learned about them. 3 characters who were all not Jewish and then converted to Judaism and had a profound impact on Judaism. In today's class, we will explore the opposite side, or the other side of this theme, which is Jews and their influence on the general society and culture around them. Before we do that, I should probably open with the most famous verse that gives this responsibility to the Jewish people. Influencing the nations of the world is in fact the role and destiny of the Jewish people. The prophet Isaiah famously says in text 1, Mark, if I can ask you to get us started, light unto the nations.
So said
We're on page 49, text 1.
So said Almighty God, who created the heavens and stretched them out, spread out the earth with all that springs from it, and gave a soul to its people and life to those who walk on it. I, God, or God, have called you with righteousness. I will strengthen your hand. I will protect you, and I will set you as a covenant for all people and a light unto the nations.
Thank you, Mark. And this is a very dramatic statement by the prophet Isaiah. God is introducing himself as the creator of the universe for all mankind. And then he turns to the Jewish people and tells them that it is their destiny to be a light unto the nations. Now, my question for you, and the exercise we're going to begin with is, who can you think of, which Jews, famous Jews, can you think of that you feel embodied this prophecy? They were a light unto the nations. In some way, they affected the larger society and the larger culture as Jews. In which Jews come to mind? And if you want to share, you can share. If not, you can put 3 names down. I just want you to put 3 names down. Anybody want to share? Yes, Tova. Come again, John? Jonas Salk. I don't even know who that is. Oh, the polio vaccine. Yes, okay, I'm sorry, I don't know his name. Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Yes, Gloria. David Ben-Gurion. He had a lot to do with the Jewish nation. But okay, I see what you're saying. Also the non-Jews of the world. Yes? Einstein, Albert Einstein. Yeah. How could we be in Pasadena? We mentioned 2 people before Einstein. Come on, guys. We got to have our local pride. Okay. Who else? Somebody said Maimonides, right? Maimonides. Why? I mean, I have a lot of reasons, but I want to hear what you have to say.
I think the influence on Judaism on religious and spirituality at a very large scale.
Right? Today, if people study religion and spirituality, they often will quote Maimonides, even if they're not Jewish. Anybody else? Yes, Joyce. Rabbi Lord Jonathan, Lord Jonathan Sachs, yes. Okay, Jeff. The Rebbe. Okay, I like that one. Very good. Yes. By the way, one of the problems, Jeff, with these kinds of names, same thing with Jonathan Sachs, I'd say a little bit, and I'm not really saying any of those are really wrong. One of those is that we're really looking for somebody that focused on the outside world, and the Rebbe and Jonathan Sachs both did. It wasn't, but they also spent a tremendous amount of time focusing on the Jewish world, that's not the light unto the nations part. Somebody else wants to share. Tova Jane, go ahead. Rabbi Heschel, yes, thank you. Yes, Dave. Sigmund Freud. Yes. Well, Abraham Lincoln wasn't Jewish. No, but we're looking right. But in this case, we're looking for Jews who influenced the non-Jewish world. By the way, Abraham Lincoln famously had a Jewish lawyer friend. And he credits a lot of his views, especially on slavery, to that Jewish friend. So that I don't remember what his name is, but it could be that Jewish friend, could be quoted. Yes, Greka. Well, again, not Jewish.
No. Isn't he the one that they said was Jewish?
No, Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus. Yes, Jeff. Israeli, very good. Yes, no, Jane. Karl Marx. Yes, maybe you don't like him, but still, yeah. All right, one more. Anybody? Danny? Yes, David Spinoza. Okay. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk about something. As you guys are writing all these names down or whatever, or calling them out, I think we ought to take a moment to narrow the definition of what we mean by being a light unto the nations. So, and like any good verse in Tanakh, there are classic commentary that is the classic traditional Jewish approach to what exactly these words mean. And this verse, to be a light unto the nations, is no different. The Radak, which is Rabbi David Kimchi, is one of the most well-accepted authorities, as is Rashi, etc., right, on what the Tanakh is saying, and he will often comment and clarify what's going on here. And so he clarifies what we mean by being a light unto the nations. Malka, if you can read for us, please, text 2 on page 50, the light of Torah.
Are you just talking here?
Yeah, just hold it, it's fine.
The Jewish people are destined to be a light unto the nations, as the verse states. Nations will go by your light, and kings by your brightness of your radiance. This refers to the light of the Torah, which will issue forth to the nations from Zion. The Jewish people will sustain the nations of the world through guiding them to observe the 7 Noahide laws and to walk in the proper path, as the verse states. Multitudes of nations will go to each other and tell one another, "Come, let us ascend to the mountain of God, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his path. For the Torah will issue forth from Zion, the word of God from Jerusalem."
So when the Torah tells us that the Jews are destined to be a light unto the nation by God, we are not just talking about making a big influence on the world. We mean making an influence on the world that is uniquely Jewish. So that means you know the Torah, you know your traditions, and then you take that and you channel that into the world in one way or another. This isn't to say that we're knocking any of the people that are mentioned here. Every single one of them had a tremendous influence on the world. What we are trying to say is that somebody like Albert Einstein, for example, besides for probably the fact that questioning everything is a very Jewish, characteristic, other than that, I don't know that E equals MC squared can be traced back to his Torah education, if he had any. I don't know. That's so. What we're talking about in today's lesson, the characters that we are going to try and explore here, are specifically characters, Jews, that influence the world with a uniquely Jewish message. In some way, their Torah study or their Torah observance or their Torah personality affected the larger world in some way or another. So Karl Marx, Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, these are all very, very important Jewish characters. And if we're talking about how Jews influence the world, absolutely, they should be front and center. Somebody who invented the polio vaccine, for sure, front and center. All these contributions are huge contributions, but for today's lesson, I want to narrow it a little bit to talk specifically about a Jewish message and a Jewish influence that there is on the world. Okay, so as you go through your list, you might be able to take some people and realize that, oh, okay, that's what we're talking about. So somebody like Maimonides or the Rebbe or Dr. Sachs, right, Rabbi Lord Dr. Sachs, these kind of people, obviously, it was their Torah their Torah message that they were spreading with the world, whereas others, it might not have been that way. Okay, that is the introduction to today's lesson. And now we're ready to introduce our first character. The first character that we're going to talk about whose uniquely Jewish influence brought the world closer to God is Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid. Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, or the prince, Nagid literally means a prince, was born in 993 in Cordoba. Cordoba today is a city in Spain, but for our story, it's important to know that the region that became Spain was not a unified country at the time, but it was a collection of small provinces, each with its own ruler. All of southern Spain at the time was Muslim, but the people were from a variety of different origins. There were Arabs, there were Berbers, there were Slavs. That was not the time to get into all of the background behind all these different peoples, but the general picture is pretty important. So on page 53, you can kind of see a little bit of that laid out for you on the map. The Jewish community in Spain had existed for centuries. According to local tradition, it actually dated back to exiles from Jerusalem after the destruction of the Second Temple. So the Second Temple gets destroyed. We know that Jews leave Israel, okay, in dribs and drabs, and then after the Bar Kokhba revolt, almost everyone. But we think of them as going down to Babylon, which was the center of Judaism at the time. But actually, according to local tradition at that time, some of them had ended up in Spain. Either way, by the time the 900s, the late 900s, that is, the turn of the millennium comes around, Spain is in the middle of its golden era of cultural and scholarly achievement. And this is the context into which Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid is born. and in which he ultimately became, a big symbol of the Jewish community. Our information about the early life of Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid is going to come. And by the way, we're going to be calling him the Nagid because that is how he is known in Jewish culture and Jewish literature. We're going to be reading from a book that is called Sefer HaKabbalah. It has nothing to do with the Kabbalah that you're familiar with. Kabbalah means tradition. So this is the book of tradition. It's a book written by Rabbi Avram ibn David, called the Radvaz, even though there's a more famous Radvaz that comes later. But called the Ravid, even though there's a more famous Ravid that comes later. That's a different conversation. The Ravid would have grown up in Cordoba, Spain, not Spain, but in Cordoba, maybe 100 years after Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid lived. And he tells us the story. Let's open with text 3. Dave, if you can read for us, please. The rise of the Nagid. Dave, Baron?
Yeah. One of the outstanding disciplines disciples of Rabbi Hanaka ben Moshe was Rabbi Shmuel Halevi, and Nagid, the prince, the son of Rabbi Yosef, surname Ibn Nagrela, of the community of Cordoba. Aside from being a great Torah scholar and highly cultured person, Rabbi Shmuel was highly versed in Arabic literature and style, and was indeed competent to serve in the king's palace. Nevertheless, he maintained himself in very modest circumstances as a spice merchant until the time when war broke out in Spain. With the termination of the rule of the house of Ibn Abi Amir and the seizure of power by the Berber chiefs, the city of Cordoba dwindled, and its inhabitants were compelled to flee. Rabbi Shmuel fled to Malaga, where he occupied a shop as a spice merchant. His shop happened to adjoin the courtyard of Abu Qasim ibn al-Arif, the vizier and scribe for King Habas, the son of Maksan, the Berber king of Granada. As a result, the scribe's maidservant would ask Rabbi Shmuel to write letters to her master when he was away from home.
Okay, let's pause right here, Dave. So for some context, you'll notice that the vizier, or second in command to the king, is actually called the scribe. And that's because this is a time when writing and writing was not common among the simple folk. So just being a scribe, being someone who was literate, was automatically a tremendous stature. So therefore the vizier is called that, and therefore Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, as you'll see in just a moment, we already started to see, they're using his skills in order to write letters. Okay? Dave, keep going. When
Ibn Arif received the letters, he was astounded at the learning they reflected. Consequently, when, after some time, the scribe was given leave by King Habas to return to his home in Malaga, he asked the people of his household, "Who wrote the letter that I received from you?" They replied, "A certain Jew from the community of Cordoba, who lives next door to your courtyard, wrote them on our behalf." The scribe ordered the Rabbi Shmuel be brought to him at once. He told him, "It does not become you to spend your time in a shop. From now on, you are to stay at my side." He thus became the scribe and counselor for the counselor of the king.
So he became the counselor to the counselor of the king. Okay, keep going.
The counsel that Rabbi Shmuel provided was remarkable and accurate, as if one had consulted the oracle of God. Thanks to his counsel, King Habas achieved successes and became exceedingly great. Subsequently, when the scribe Ibn al-Arif took ill and felt his death approaching, King Habas paid him a visit and said to him, "What am I going to do? Who will counsel me in the wars that surround me on every side?" Ibn al-Arif replied, "I never counseled you out of my own mind, but out of the mind of this Jew, my scribe. Look after him well, and let him be like a father and guide to you. Do whatever he says, and God will help you." Accordingly, after the scribe's death, King Habas brought Rabbi Shmuel Halevi to his palace and made him scribe and counselor. Thus he entered the king's palace in the year 478.
Or 1020 to the Common Era. Right? So Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid is born during the golden era of Spain, and he starts off his life living his simple, nice Jewish life. He's a spice merchant. He's probably studying a lot of Torah. He's a wonderful, learned Torah scholar, and he happens to know, as a result of that, how to read and write. Right? And then all of a sudden, he's noticed first by the family of the vizier, and then by the vizier himself. Then he becomes his counselor, and then eventually, after he dies, he becomes a counselor, literally an advisor to the king at the time. Okay. This was an unprecedented event in Muslim Spain. I want to point that out. Jews were considered second-class citizens. I assume, raise your hand if you're familiar with the term dhimmi.
Say it again.
The term dhimmi. Dhimmi is a Muslim, an Islamic term brought up in the Quran, wherein someone who doesn't want to convert to Islam can live in a Muslim led or a Muslim governed country, but as a second-class citizen. And Jews were first and foremost in this regard. They were considered dhimmi, they were considered second-class, etc. And here you have this rabbi who becomes, they weren't suitable for any position. A second-class citizen meant that they shouldn't really be in any position of power. And here you have this rabbi who becomes literally a counselor to the king. And as the king is fighting wars, this rabbi is counseling him on how to do so. The reasons that are given for this are usually just simple. I mean, the Berbers were very poor, certainly poorly educated, and they needed Rabbi Shmuel's genius and his linguistics and his talents, and therefore he rose to power. In addition, I think there's something to be said about various Muslim populations warring against each other, and a Jew, especially because of his second-class citizen and his removedness from this conflict, would be able to provide probably a more trusted position of advice for someone like a king who has to worry about rebellions and those that are really traitors and spies, etc. In any event, so Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid becomes this high-ranking, almost military official. Obviously, his business prospered as a result. The moment that he was in a position of power, his spice business began to prosper, as did the rest of his business, and he became fabulously wealthy. And that's why it was natural that at a certain point, I think we have the year 1027 down as the date, he becomes appointed as a Nagid, or the prince of the Jewish community of the kingdom of Granada. So at the time, Nagid was like, think of other terms that you're familiar with, like Nasi, or Rosh Kabahag, which means Rosh Kobe Agola, all these different terms that were used for the in exile, in a particular exile, the Jewish leader of this community. So Nagid was the name that he was given, or at least the position that he was given. As Nagid, Rabbi Shmuel became a patron of Torah study. We'll soon read in text 4 all about how he would pay actually for books, for Torah books, that is, for students who needed them. He represented the interests of the Jewish people in the royal court, and he maintained relationships with Jewish centers in other Spanish kingdoms, such as, for example, North Africa, which you'll see in text 4 is known as Ifriqiya. I don't want to get into all the different names for the same regions that we're familiar with today, but Ifriqiya is not Africa, it's technically North Africa, which is Tunisia and that region. Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, that area of Africa. He also maintains relationships with the Jews that are in Israel, the Jews that are in Babylonia, which are obviously the larger Jewish communities at the time. And the Ravid, who we've been reading from, this Sefer HaKabbalah, continues by describing Rabbi Shmuel's work, what he looked like as a Nagid. Susan, if you can read for us, please, text 4 on page 58.
Rabbi Shmuel was appointed as Nagid in 4787 and then 1027. He achieved tremendous good for the Jewish people in Spain, the Maghreb, Ifriqiya, Egypt, Sicily, and even as far as the Academy in Babylonia and the holy city of Jerusalem. He provided material benefits from his own purse for Torah students in all these countries. He also purchased many books, copies of the Holy Scriptures, as well as of the Mishnah and Talmud, which are considered sacred texts. Throughout Spain and the countries just mentioned, whoever wished to devote themselves full-time to the study of the Torah found in him a patron. Moreover, he retained scribes to produce copies of the Mishnah and Talmud, which he presented to students who were unable to purchase copies themselves, both in the academies of Spain as well as in the other countries mentioned. These gifts were complemented with annual contributions of olive oil for the synagogues of Jerusalem, which he would dispatch from his own estate.
Thank you. So we get an idea of him now in a position of power, all right? What I want to do now is I really want to pivot to focus on one element of his role as advisor to the king, okay? And in order to do so, we need to move to the next king, all right? So King Habas, who we've been discussing so far, that he's been his advisor, his trusted advisor, dies in the year 1038 to the Common Era. There was a power struggle, as usually happens, between two of his sons. One's name was Badis, and the other one was Bulugin. Most of the political and military elites, certainly those that were wealthy and in power, backed Bulugin. I'm not familiar with all the details of this conflict, but most of them backed Bulugin. But actually, most of the masses, the general public, backed Badis. And Rabbi Shmuel went against the grain and actually threw his support behind Badis. And as a result, when Badis ultimately rose to power, he trusted Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, obviously, tremendously, because his support was there with him from the beginning, and he felt that he could trust him. It's at this time, after Badis rises to power, so this is again around 1038, that we find Rabbi Shmuel in a new position, and that is the position of military commander. Very unexpected. You have this Jew who's born into a nice Jewish family, becomes a spice merchant and a Torah scholar, and now all of a sudden he's literally strategizing about how to fight wars. From 1038 until his death in 1056, Rabbi Shmuel was occupied practically every year for several months at war, which is a mind-boggling concept. Like choose your rabbi and just imagine them as like, oh, the rabbinic part was like kind of like 10% of his time, and 90% of his time he was actually strategizing on war. My parallel for this is always the Rebbe, because the Rebbe famously, anytime Israeli military analysts would come to the Rebbe, they always said they felt that the Rebbe had like such a key finger on the pulse when it came to everything that was going on with the military and strategies, etc., all over the Middle East. Yet, that in no way can you say that was the Rebbe's main focus, or even a large focus. The Rebbe cared about it, and the Rebbe made a point of giving his advice in this regard, but I don't think you can say to any degree that was the Rebbe's main focus. But with Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, military leadership was a tremendous percentage of his role. 1 second, Mark. I will take questions in just a minute. And by the way, this is unique. This is extremely unique in Jewish history. Since the exile of the Jewish people and the loss of Jewish independence, you don't really find this. In other words, sure, King David, King Solomon, yeah, when Jews are governing the land of Israel, fighting wars, that happens. But not after that. And Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid is a huge exception. And that would be enough, by the way, to make Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid an extraordinary figure in Jewish history, but that's not all. He wasn't just a Talmudist. He wasn't just a halachic scholar. We're soon going to see that he also had a tremendous brilliance in terms of what's sort of compendium, of being able to have within his mind a compendium of all of Jewish literature and to be able to put it together. And we'll get to that in just a moment. In order to get to that, I need to tell you one more fact about his life, which is that he was a very, very accomplished poet. And one of the things that we have surviving from Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid is actually books of his poetry. And believe it or not, many of his poems, which were later published by his son, deal with gratitude and thanks to the Almighty for his victories at war. All right, so that's what we're going to do now. It's quite a long poem. Gail, are you up to reading it? Text 5? Okay, so let me just set it up just a little more. Text 5 begins with his son introducing the poem. If you're following the English, so you'll kind of see when the text layout switches from being paragraphs to being like these two-liners, which is more poetic style. That's where it switches. And just to show you just how long it is, you see the ellipses 1, 2, 3, 4 times. They're trying to kind of give you an idea. By they, I mean JLI. They've kind of like given us snippets of it so that you get an idea of what these poems are about without making it exhaustive. If you would like to see more of his poems, a lot of them have been translated into English, and I'll put a link in the after lesson email So if you'd like to explore the poems of Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, but many of them are on similar themes to what we have here in front of us. So we'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, very good. The answer is Hebrew, but we'll get to that in just a moment. I want to talk a lot about languages today. So you're jumping the gun here, but we're going to talk about it. Gail, go ahead. A battlefield vow.
So this starts at the end of the
Page 61.
end of the italics at the bottom.
Yeah. So at the end of the English. So it's really not page 61. I guess it's.
Okay.
Where does the English start? Yeah.
God has enabled me to expound on the
No.
Torah.
Hold on. No. Hold on. Why don't you start with his son's introduction, Rabbi Yosef HaNagid?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
A disastrous war erupted in the month of Iyar of the year 4809, which was also 1049. This disaster unfolded when the inhabitants of Malaga betrayed our forces in the mountains. On a Thursday, that was the last day of the month of Iyar, May 10th. As a result, mighty officers were killed in the battle, and my father, may the exalted God bring him honor, was captured. God saved him in a remarkable and unprecedented manner. After his rescue, he made a vow to collect and compose Hilchata Gibarata, a comprehensive compendium of Jewish laws. To introduce this work, he penned the following poem, which describes the war and his deliverance. I could probably let somebody else read it.
Okay, so let me actually jump in here, and then we'll have Tova Jane or Marshall, one of you, if you can read the actual poem. Let me jump in here, because this is what I want to talk about. Hilchata Gibrata is one of those books. Remember we discussed them last week? It's one of those books that we do not have extant today. But we have many quotations to it. In fact, somebody put together a book trying to build from all the quotes from Hilchata Gibrata. He tried to put together as much as we can of that book. What it seems like is, and again, this is the book that he publishes as a thanks to the Almighty for the fact that God made him succeed and victorious in this particular war, which obviously was very, very difficult and very fraught with danger and potential failure. And instead, God, in a remarkable and miraculous way, we don't get details, but these are the words of his son, God makes him win. And as a way of gratitude to the Almighty, he actually composes this work. Now, we don't have it extant, but because we have so many quotations, we get an idea as to what it was, okay? It was the most similar to what Maimonides does a couple of 100 years later, maybe 200 years later, which is a compendium of all Jewish law, right? So that means you have to be well-versed in the entire Tanakh, and then the entire Talmud, and then he puts it down into an all-encompassing Jewish law, a summary of Jewish law based on topic. Not following the order of the Talmud, but going through it based on category of each topic and going through it in that manner. This would have been a huge and monumental work at its time. And in fact, to the best of our understanding, those that came after him until Maimonides and then Maimonides were following in his footsteps. So for those that are familiar from the Decoding the Talmud course, we spoke about this a little bit. In the Book Smart course, we spoke about this a little bit. We spoke about the Rith, or Rabbeinu Alphas, who was the one who published the Talmud, but then took out all the arguments. So he kind of redacted the Talmud to make it much, much smaller, just to get to the point. The Rush, and then finally Maimonides. All these compendiums, which are trying essentially to give us almost a code of Jewish law, are all following in his footsteps. Okay, so the reason I'm pointing this out is because it really gives you an idea of who this man was. He was a military commander, but that didn't make him any less of a Torah scholar in terms of his accomplishments that way. And his name really was all over the Jewish world at the time. But let's get to the poem. Tova Jane, can you read for us, please? God has enabled me.
God has enabled me to expound on the Torah and mitzvot and blessed me with the ability to issue rulings. Listen to me, therefore, you virtuous people, and hear the Torah explained virtuously. I inquire into God's rules as best I can, as far as my mind can probe. I point out the common errors to avert them and write down the proper laws to establish them. I inscribe that which is beyond dispute articulately and with clarity. I exhume every straight matter that is laying buried, and lead every distorted matter to its grave. God, protect the doors of my lips and mouth from expressing foreign and misguided notions. Be with my words to help me, just as you assist me in my misfortune. Just as you recently delivered me into the hands of oppressors, and they decreed death on me. Nevertheless, you showed great mercy to me when I was captured on the day of my calamity. You delivered me into their hands, but you were my mighty tower, my secure fortress. They seized me with their hands, but I was riding upon the precious cloud. They rushed to kill me with arrows like fiery flames, with spears like strong beams. They thought they could kill me with these weapons, but behold, their hands were tied behind their backs. The bands of my enemies were shamed, and my allies sang praise to the God of the universe. Therefore, on my lips, all the days and nights will be songs for the mighty God. Who can say that the dead will not be resurrected? I am a dead man brought up from the grave.
Thank you, Tova Jane. And on page 63, so this poem was an introduction to this monumental work that he put together, which again, we don't have today, but we do have many quotations from it pointing to it being around. On page 63, you can see one of those quotations. This is actually not a quotation. This is a fragment of what would have been a copy of the book that was found anywhere? Anybody? In the Cairo Geniza, right? So they found, again, this is one of those things that when they uncovered the Cairo Geniza, they were like, oh, whoa, hold on a second. This is that we were aware that it exists, but we didn't have any pieces of it in existence, so we still don't have the whole thing, but at least we have fragments of it that kind of give us that kind of idea. One of the reasons, by the way, that it would have been lost, like Maimonides, I mean, okay, part of it is that he comes 200 years later, but another reason that some of these things get lost is because if they were superseded by another composition, which then took its place, as was the case with Hilchot HaGibrata, it would have been replaced, so to speak, by the Rif's work, Rabbeinu Alphas, so then that would have become more common, and that's why we have that extant today. So that's just to give you an idea of historically how these things work. Now, his contemporaries were not very happy about this. And there are legends about Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid up the wazoo. I'll share one just briefly because they're fun. There's a story that goes that there was an Arab or a Muslim official who was jealous of his position of power, and anytime he would see Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, he would curse him. And the king once caught sight of him doing so, right? And he said to Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, how do you put up with this? He said, put him to death. And to Rabbi Shmuel, he said to not put him to death. He said, cut out his tongue. Cut out his tongue. Oh, just some cheers. It's okay. All right. Cut out his tongue, because his tongue cursed you out, right? So therefore you should cut out his tongue.
But he didn't say that.
No, the king said that. Now Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid didn't want to do this. So what he did instead was he had heard about this story. So every time he would pass by this Arab fellow, he would just kind of say positive things about him, and he would looking for where they have the details of this story. Here we go. He would send him expensive gifts, and he would praise him, and he would say all sorts of nice things about him whenever he was in his vicinity, right? So eventually the man kind of realized, oh, I really started up with the wrong guy. And what he says is, what they say is that he came to Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid and he apologized. And he said, please, it's okay. And Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid said, it's fine. You're okay. And he all of a sudden became his biggest ally. Now, many months later, the king saw this particular Arab official. So he says to Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, what did you do? I told you to cut his tongue out. So Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid said, I did. I cut out his tongue and I replaced it with a good tongue. So that's one of the legends that goes on about Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid. But as you can imagine, not everybody was such a fan of his. That's why I'm sharing that story. But there are also some things that we have today, historical writings about Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid from the Arab world, which even though they might not have been the biggest fans of his, they had to admit that he was a very, very intelligent person, a very successful military commander, etc. So on page 64, text 6, so this comes from what's known as There is a book called Bassam al-Dakira. And in that book, there are poems and writings of Al-Munfatil. And I guess what's important to understand is that Ibn Bassam is a rabid anti-Semite, and you'll see it in his book. If you go and look at this in context, you'll see that he criticizes Al-Munfatil for writing positively about a Jew, about Rabbi Shmuel Nagid. But you'll see that even so, he has to quote it, and you see just how much he heaps praises onto Rabbi Shmuel Nagid. Take a look at text 6 on page 64. Who's reading for us? Marcia? Those who count.
In praise of the night?
Yes.
The Nagid, rather. Those who count Moses and among them and enjoy, oh God, I can't read this. Enjoy his
That's okay. Do you want us to move on to someone else?
high, his light. Say what you want about them, but you will never arrive at one of the test of their qualities. Somebody else take it.
Sure. Rachel, you want to read for us, please? Text 6 on page 64. Thank you, Marcia.
Those who count Moses among them and enjoy his light, say what you want about them, but you will not arrive at 1/10 of their qualities. How many visible marvels on earth they have accomplished, how many generous gifts they have continuously given to people. You, another, are superior to the noblemen of the Orient and the Occident. Oh, you want a mic? You want a mic?
It's okay. Just keep reading.
Yeah, that's okay. Noblemen of the Orient and the Occident, just as gold is superior to copper in importance. If people could distinguish between doom and the right way, they would only have to kiss your 10 fingers. Thanks to you, I have won this world and I have satisfied my wishes. And thanks to you, I long to meet the same gain in the other world. I profess openly the religion of Saturday when I stand before you, and when I am among my compatriots, I believe in that religion secretly.
Whoa.
That's now this. I don't think most scholars are not under the impression that he converted to Judaism, but this very well-known Arabic poet actually says that he believes in the truth of Judaism. He openly professes the Jewish religion, and he appreciates the truth of it. Thus, I think, to summarize, Rabbi Shmuel Nagid serves as a very influential Jew, a model for those who aspire to excellence in both religious and secular worlds without sacrificing anything. He managed to be a successful advisor to the king, military general, etc., and at the same time be a tremendous Torah scholar, and in fact have influence on at least some non-Jews in a tremendous way. Yes, Danny. Absolutely, I imagine there were challenges like that. But I think his life story shows us that it's possible. Right? You know, think of him as like a Joe Lieberman of the day, or something like that, right? I don't know if Joe Lieberman was quite as... Yeah, go ahead, Vicky.
In his writings, did he discuss at all how he handled Shabbat and how he took...
Not to the best of my knowledge, no.
Stop on Shabbat, right?
No, right, not to the best of my knowledge. He doesn't.
That would have been interesting to see his insight. And also, is he any relationship, you know, if you're still out in Israel, Shmuel Hanavi is...
So Shmuel HaNavi was, so hold on, first of all, Shmuel HaNavi was Samuel the prophet. He was a prophet, lived during the times of the prophets, over 1,000 years earlier. But you are on the right track because there is a street in Israel that's called Rachov Shmuel HaNagid. There is a street named after him. Yes?
I don't see how, we started out with the premise, these are people who have Jewish values that influence...
Ooh, yes.
And I don't see...
You don't see that with Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid. Okay, so you are correct. I meant to say this at the beginning of the lesson and I didn't, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so. We are going to get more and more intense as we go through the 3 characters of today in terms of how much it was directly related to their Judaism that they influenced the world. The reason I think Rabbi Shmuel Nagid fits into that category is both because the origin of how he becomes a military commander and an advisor to the king is because of his Jewish studies and etc. And then later on, you start to see people, and I think this last one is probably the best. Obviously, it's just an example, right? like an anecdote, if you will. But we can imagine that there were many people like that would have been impressed, just like this Al Munfatil, who actually appreciated the truth of Judaism because of Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid. Where you are correct, though, is that he does not go around preaching to non-Jews, serving as a light unto the nations that way. It was kind of more just by being who he was, which was a Torah scholar and a Torah observant Jew, etc. They respected him for that, and in that way he may have served as a light, etc. But the next character, and I'm going to use this as a segue, even though I know there are some more questions, but we are running a little late here. The next character that I'd like to introduce is actually going to be much more direct. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to say so. The next character we are going to introduce today is Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael, or sometimes you'll see him referred to as Manasseh ben Israel. His impact is going to be much more direct in terms of that he actually made a career, so to speak, out of influencing the non-Jewish world with the Jewish belief for the world, not by trying to convert them. As we saw already last week, that's not a Jewish value, to go out and proselytize and try to convert people to Judaism. But at least to try and convert them to be what we would call a Noahide, or a righteous among the nations. In other words, a non-Jew living a proper life as per the Jewish faith would require of them. On page 65, you can see what seems to be an engraved portrait of Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael by a Jewish artist whose name was Salom Italia. It's from 1642. There is another portrait by Rembrandt. We're soon going to learn that Rembrandt and Menashe ben Yisrael actually had a lot of they did a lot of collaborating, what we call it today, in the social media world, right? They used to collab a lot. So it wouldn't be far off to say that he painted a painting of Menashe ben Yisrael. However, the painting that people sometimes identify as Menashe ben Yisrael, there is a consensus among modern scholars that it's not, in fact, Rabbi Menashe, and that it's someone else instead. So that's why we didn't bring that painting. But here you can see another painting, which is clearly, the consensus is that this is what Menashe ben Yisrael would have looked like, and this is an engraving of his portrait. Now, in order to give you the background for Menashe ben Yisrael's life, we have to start in 1492. In 1492, what happens? Very good. The famous expulsion of the Jewish people from Spain. And at that time, the Jews of Spain were presented with a stark choice. Do you convert to Christianity, whether openly or whether become a converso or whatever it is, or do you leave the country? Many left the country and went to Portugal. Unfortunately, that was short-lived because they arrived in Portugal, and in 1497, King Manuel of Portugal also issued an expulsion decree. Officially, he gave them the opportunity to leave the country and not convert to Christianity, but that was actually just a pretext. And when tens of thousands of Jews started to arrive at the port cities in order to leave Portugal, he closed the ports and forced them all to convert, because he didn't want to lose all of these wealthy and important and well-connected people and have his whole economy fall apart. Now, so as we know, many of the Jews of Spain and Portugal, as a result, became what are known as conversos, Marranos, or secretive Jews, all these different names that are given to them. Some of them are considered offensive. Regardless, for the purpose of today's conversation, we'll call them conversos. And we're going to read now a text that, even with its censorship, so JLI kind of took certain pieces. If anybody wants to read those, I have them here, the full text of it. But they tried to censor it so that it's not as gruesome. We're going to be reading an account of one particular family and the way that they were arrested and how they were tortured into admitting crimes, into confessing crimes that they hadn't perpetrated at the hands of the Inquisition. We have these today. The records of the Inquisition are well preserved, and they actually preserved their own crimes, if you will, different than the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, who tried to hide everything that they did. And so we'll read here text 7 from the records of the Inquisition. Vicky, you have the mic?
As Gaspar Rodriguez Nunes sat in his cell waiting for his 4th session with the Lisbon Inquisition, he was in excruciating pain. His 3 previous stints on the rack and the hoist had seriously damaged his 39-year-old body. During the first round of torture, on August 28, 1596, Gaspar defended his innocence. The torturer was directed to apply more pressure. After a month to reflect on his offenses and to heal somewhat, Gaspar was again subjected to this cruel examination, despite the fact that the first torture had not been properly carried out because of the mishap which Gaspar seemed to have suffered. Apparently he had fainted and his limbs swelled up, so the session ended prematurely. Still, he confessed to nothing. On the third occasion, the inquisitors decided that hanging him by his arms, tied behind his back, might be a more effective technique. This time, Gaspar did indeed confess. He said that while he had been baptized as a child and lived outwardly as a Catholic for decades, he was a Jew and had believed in the law of Moses for the past 16 or 17 years. The Lisbon authorities were not satisfied with Gaspar's confessions. It seemed he had not named enough names, and so yet another torture session was scheduled for early February 1597. It was now almost 4 years since Gaspar's arrest, and he was a broken man, both mentally and physically. Gaspar told his examiners that his arms were in a bad way and that he would not be able to withstand further torture. In light of this, the members of the Holy Tribunal decided that this was enough. Gaspar Rodriguez Nunes, maimed in his right arm and his hand, and his body covered with lesions, was released from prison on February 27th. He was ordered to appear in an auto de fe in Lisbon, where he would be reconciled with the church. He was forced to give up all his property, accept a form of house arrest, attend Mass regularly, and wear the San Benito outside the home.
Okay, I want to talk about a few things here. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of background to just understand that, first of all, there's many more gruesome details that were left out here, especially details about the torture. But there's another detail that was left out, which I actually want to talk to you about, which is that emotionally and psychologically, this would have been even more difficult for Gaspar, because the person who denounced him, who kind of gave him up to the government, was actually his own wife. I think it's important to understand that you're talking about a time when the Inquisition would catch a glimpse of some informant would come to the Inquisition and tell them, we caught a glimpse of some woman lighting candles on a Friday afternoon. They would arrest her and then torture her until she would give up another name. And in this case, it was his own wife who had given up his name. She had in turn been informed on by her cousin. You can imagine the discord and the psychological, insanity that was going on, perhaps rivaled only by Hamas today, and what happened in Gaza on October 7th, and then with the spectacles that they were putting on just a few months ago, etc. This kind of psychological torture, which went along together with the physical torture. I also want to explain some of the terms that there are at the end of text 7. So, an auto da fe. Raise your hand if you're familiar with what an auto da fe is. Okay, so auto da fe's are they were these public sentencing ceremonies for people accused by the Inquisition of heresy, and they're actually most well known. I imagine those that pick up their hands are familiar mainly with the main sentence that happened at an auto da fe, which was public burning. But that wasn't the case with every single person. They were public sentences. So some of them would be burnt at the stake, and all the Jews would be forced to watch this, etc. Never mind if they were conversos, they had to pretend to be happy about it. This was a crazy, traumatic time. So Rabbi Shmuel Nagid lived, or at least was born, during the golden era of Judaism in Spain, and then it comes to an abrupt halt here in 1492, 1497, and we're here in the 1590s, and it's still pretty horrible for the Jews in Spain and Portugal. Okay, so he is sentenced at an auto da fe, but he is not sentenced to be burned to death. He is sentenced to wear the San Benedito, right? The San Benedito was kind of a yellow and red garment that publicly identified him as a Jew. Surprise, surprise, the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, did not come up with this concept, okay? And this was considered a public shaming, etc. Now, the cool part about Gaspar's story is that the sad and painful story of Gaspar Rodriguez Nunes actually has a happy ending. In 1604, a few years after his release, right, so he's released at the end of the 1500s, 1590-something, in 1604, he actually is blessed with the birth of a son. We're skipping a couple of years here. He actually remarries his wife who had informed on him. Tells you a little bit about what was going on then. Anyways, and then she dies and he marries someone else and they are blessed with a son. He names the son Manuel Diaz Soyerio, okay? Shortly thereafter, Gaspar decides to flee Lisbon with his family to escape the Inquisition's reach, and after a few stops along the way, he arrives in Amsterdam in 1614 with a son who is 10 years old, okay? During this time, Amsterdam, once again, was a very neutral place. Perhaps not friendly, but definitely a very neutral place for Jews to be living. It was beyond the clutches of the Inquisition, and it was considered safe to be Jewish. Raise your hand if you've been to the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. As have I. It's fantastic. If you haven't been, I highly encourage you to go there. There are actually, you can look through records, and you see all these names of Jews that clearly came from Spain and Portugal that are living in Amsterdam in this massive shul. Especially as a rabbi, you see that the shul is being run according to Sephardic customs, which would not have been the local customs in Amsterdam, but were carried over from Spain and Portugal. Whole era of Jewish history that I'm really not doing justice to, but we want to get back to the story of this young boy, Manuel Diaz Soyerio. In Amsterdam, the family was able to publicly and fully embrace their Judaism. After over 100 years of risking their lives to practice Judaism undercover, they were now able to bring it out into the open. Gaspar becomes Yosef, his son Manuel becomes Menashe, and the family name becomes Ben Yisrael. This 10-year-old boy, young Menashe Ben Yisrael, receives a solid, nice Jewish education. Why? He's growing up in Amsterdam, right? Amsterdam is the golden Medina of the time. It's the golden land of the time. Finally, freedom. I can bring up my child and I can bring up my son and give him a proper Jewish education. He was an excellent student. And before long, he was teaching in the school, writing a book on Hebrew grammar, and then at the young age of 18, succeeding his teacher as rabbi of one of the Amsterdam synagogues. Rabbi Menashe opened the first Hebrew printing press in Amsterdam, which focused on producing Hebrew and Spanish books for prayer. I want you to understand this. Think of, for example, post-Holocaust era, right? Lots of Jews immigrating to the United States. All of a sudden, their children speaking English, and they're like, hold on, how do we educate these children in English? And you start to see in the 1940s and 1950s, 1960s, you start to see a tremendous boom in the amount of English translated, and English translated Siddur, and English translated Chumash, etc. You start to see that happening. In Amsterdam, the same thing was happening. So he's writing Hebrew, Spanish books of prayer for these ex-converso Jews that are arriving here in Amsterdam and who had re-embraced their Judaism. He also authored and published a number of books of his own, including a Spanish language guide to Jewish law, which is called Teosuro dos Dinim. And most famously, he authors a book called El Conciliatador, or The Conciliator. What is The Conciliator? The Conciliator is a book which most of you, if it was written in English, would pick up off the shelf immediately. It essentially claims to reconcile all different sorts of contradictions that there are between Torah and science, right? Science of the time, obviously not science of today. But this has been a time-honored tradition of Jews, right? Jews who believe in the Torah, believe that the Torah is true, and all of a sudden the current science of the day says X, Y, or Z, and we want to understand it through the lens of science. And he writes this book. It's not just Torah and science, it's also contradictions within the Torah itself, common questions. Hey, how could this? How could that? Why did God do this, right? We see in one place that God is this way, and another place that God is that way, etc. And he's answering these questions for this new Jewish audience. But perhaps most interestingly is that the book was not only geared towards the Jewish audience. And this is where we get to text 8. In the introduction to El Conciliatador, anybody Spanish in the audience? I hope not, because I'm probably butchering all these pronunciations. It's a good thing Leticia is not here today. She'd be correcting me on everything. So in the introduction to this book, The Conciliator, Rabbi Menashe presents that he's not just writing this book for the Jewish audience, but actually a big part of his target audience is the non-Jewish audience. Danny, can you read for us, please? Text 8, Jewish prestige.
I conceive that my work will be acceptable to the learned, for if duly examined, will find that the study and lecture of the Talmud were not considered unimportant. Some of the present questions were asked by the Alexandrians of Rabbi Joshua ben Hanina, an illustrious and learned sage, as stated in the Gemara of Nida. We also learned from Berachot, Holin, and other parts that some heathen princes mooted similar doubts to the ancients, who, as disciples of the prophets, could alone interpret and solve many passages, which, from their difficulty, would otherwise have been unintelligible. No little honor will accrue from it to the Hebrew nation and the sages of Israel, as the knowledge and intelligence they possessed will be clearly seen in this work.
Thank you. I assume everybody's familiar with the term no little honor. In ancient English, this means a great honor, right? It's like that was the poetic style of the day. And the same thing earlier when he says, where is it? Twice it happens. Yeah, double negative. We're not considered unimportant. Did everybody catch that one? Anyways, that's the language of the time. That's the archaic way of the time. So on page 69, we have a copy of the front page of the book. In another book by Rabbi Nachman Israel, he actually quotes the 7 Noahide laws, believe it or not. Jeff, you want to read them for us, please? Text 9. Universal laws.
In the same way, great Lord, that in any well-governed republic, the subjects are given laws under which to live. Being God, the architect and supreme creator of the universe, it must be believed infallibly that he has constituted laws for his subjects and creatures. Because otherwise, how could the world be sustained? Or what way would there be to live among men if they were not governed by divine command? Thus, we believe that he has given to all nations the 7 precepts, which are called the laws of the sons of Noah, who are all over the world, and these are not to idolize, not to kill, I would think that would be not to murder, not to adulterate,
not so simple, yeah, go ahead.
Not to steal, not to curse in the name of God, not to eat the meat of live animals, and to establish judges who enforce these laws. Also to the children of Israel, whom he chose as his people, he further established the law of Moses, contained in 613 precepts.
This is not the only place where he lists the 7 Noahide laws, but this introduction actually is being written to a Dutch scholar whose name was Enrique Offinser. And so you start to see that he's actually actively reaching out to people. He's reaching out to famous non-Jews. At some point, he even sends a copy of I think it was of the Conciliator to King Henry at the time in England. He's really trying to influence the non-Jewish world with these laws, and we'll soon see that to a certain degree, he was definitely successful. I just wanted to talk about these 7 Noahide laws for just a moment. I think I mentioned them briefly last week. The 7 Noahide laws are so-called only because they were concluded with the 7th law, which was given to Noah, and of course, because all humanity, according to Jewish tradition, comes from Noah, because the entire world was wiped out with the Great Flood, and then Noah picks that up, or whatever. Noah restarts the generations of the world. The 7 Noahide laws really read as kind of a basic general guide to morality and ethics and principles or principled living. As you go through them, you start to notice that they really kind of give you a way to live that's much more broad than the Jewish 613 laws. It's not going to tell you to wear fringes on the side of your garment. It's not going to tell you to shake a lulav on a certain day or to commemorate the exodus from Egypt with Passover. But it will tell you general principles for a society to live in an abject morality. In other words, a morality that's not subjective to human beings, but that actually comes from God. And we'll soon see that this becomes the origin of something that's called natural law, which then influences to a tremendous degree the Constitution of the United States. I know I jumped there. Right? I mean, we're already in the 1400s. I'm sorry, 1500s already. But we'll soon see how much this influences all of these things. The 7 Noahide laws essentially work as follows. The first one is not to serve idolatry. This provides a general framework for fashioning a moral world based on a single creator. We don't believe that there are multiple gods and that if you want to serve this God, you have to serve in this way and that, but rather that the same creator of the world actually gave laws to the universe with which they ought to live. That is the first and fundamental law of the 7 Noahide laws. The second one is blasphemy. Blasphemy is forbidden not because God has a thin skin and takes offense when we criticize him, but rather because it demonstrates that if we embrace a higher authority, we're embracing it in a way that we actually are submitting to that higher authority. Not like, oh, today I'm in the mood of him, and tomorrow I'm not in the mood of him. There's a certain respect There's a certain authority that that higher power has over our lives. When you continue into number 3, that's where it starts to affect your day-to-day life. No illicit relationships. The family is the core and the bedrock of society. When you have a proper family which is respectful of each other and which has a harmony within it and which loves each other, etc., then you can go on to build proper lives. And that's why illicit relationships are forbidden even among all the nations of the world. Forget being Jewish and following Jewish laws. It continues with murder, theft, cruelty to animals. All of these essentially are telling humanity, you have to live a principled life. You have to live a life of compassion. You have to live a life where, yes, there's me and what I want to do, but I also am part of a greater society, and in order to do that, I have to respect others around me. And that extends to human beings as well as to animals. And really, that extends also to plant life and to inanimate objects, but that's beyond the scope of this particular law. And finally, any good society is going to need to have a judiciary. The Torah does not tell us what type of judiciary a Noahide or a Noahide society, let's call it, a non-Jewish society, has to have for itself. It just says that there needs to be one. You need to figure out a way that these laws are actually going to be upheld, not just by God, but by you and people as a society. You can see the 7 Noahide laws listed on page 71. It's important to note that each of these laws is kind of very general. There's like a lot of categories underneath, and there's discussion among Jewish commentary about which details and which laws apply to non-Jews or not. Anytime there's a mitzvah in the Torah, there's a discussion among commentary about whether non-Jews are also obligated in this mitzvah or not. Now, we Jews have a responsibility to be promoting these 7 Noahide laws to the non-Jews around us. And Joyce, if you can read this for us, please, in text 10, which is from Maimonides on page 72, promoting the Noahide code.
Moses delivered to us the divine command to ensure that all inhabitants of the world accept the Noahide laws. Anyone who accepts these 7 laws and observes them is considered one of the righteous among the nations and earn themselves a place in the world to come. This is contingent on acceptance of the laws because they were commanded by God in the Torah, and Moses informed us that Noah's descendants had previously been commanded to observe them.
Okay. During the temple era, this would have been a simple thing, right? Think of like during King Solomon's temple era, right? This would have been a simple thing. King Solomon Israel was governed by the Jewish people. If a non-Jew lived there, and not just if a non-Jew lived there, we know of many non-Jews that came to King Solomon, that came to the Jewish kingdoms to learn about morality, etc. And then as a Jewish government, they were preaching this type of morality for all those around them. By the way, there are laws for non-Jewish subjects who want to live in Israel under a Jewish kingdom, which were followed in the times of King Solomon and during the 1,000 years when there was a Jewish kingdom in Israel. However, as Menashe and Israel pointed out in text 8, as the temple was destroyed and the Jewish people are in exile, that becomes a very, very different obligation. This responsibility to promote the 7 Noahide laws, in other words, to promote a moral framework that is of divine origin, becomes a much more nuanced and sensitive job. And Menashe ben Israel made this his life's mission. Via political and philosophical influence, he reaches out to all those that he knows, writing books and sending letters and sending copies of books and teaching the Torah to many, many non-Jews and encouraging them to follow the Noahide laws, to follow a moral and ethical value, etc. There was particular interest in Noahide laws, as I mentioned, because at the time, Christian political scholars were attempting to develop the concept of natural law. In other words, laws that are intrinsic to the human condition. And while I don't think Rabbi Menashe was the instigator of this interest, he did play an important role in its development. Let's take a look at text 11. Gloria, you want to read for us, please? Page 73.
Am I supposed to
Just leave it in front of you. You're good.
Okay, all right. Okay, several eminent Christian scholars, all of them Christian Hebraists, evinced an extraordinary interest in Noahide law. Menashe was in contact with 2 such scholars, Hugo Grotius and Peter Cunius, and was undoubtedly familiar with the third, John Selden. These scholars had rediscovered, as it were, in rabbinic and Old Testament sources, an ancient model for governance, one they believed to be something resembling, if not constituting, an ancient articulation of natural law. Cuneus associated Noahide law with something like natural law in his work of 1617, De Republica Hebraeum Libre III. Grotius did the same in his De Jure Belli Thesis, 1625. In 1640, the Christian Hebraist John Selden published his De Jure Naturale, an entire work that takes at its premise that Noahide law and the law of nature are one and the same. Selden cited Menashe as an authority.
Okay, so what you're seeing here is you're starting to see a train of an idea that starts in the Torah as the 7 Noahide laws and this universal code for all mankind, etc. Just as Christian scholars are trying to come up with something that they're calling natural law, these scholars, whether they were mentioned, Hugo Grotius was a Dutch philosopher and a diplomat. Petrus Cuneus, is that how you pronounce it? Was a Dutch political theorist. Selden. John Selden was an English jurist and scholar, and they're writing their works in the 1600s, and some of them are even quoting Menashe ben Israel, right? In other words, they're quoting him, whether they studied with him, whether they read some of his works, whether they interacted with him. We have different levels of historical evidence to each one, but definitely they're all influenced by him. This circle of people then goes on to influence the next circle of people, which are figures that we're already familiar with. Raise your hand. John Locke, James Harrington, right? This is already your high school education coming into play, right? Why are we familiar with these people? Because these are what we call the father of liberalism, etc. The authors of something of concepts such as natural law, but then also James Harrington wrote, what was it called, Oceania? Anybody? Somebody remember? You guys all need to go back to high school. That's it. Anyways, which then in turn influences the founders of America. I'm just kind of trying to make that connection. It's not a direct connection. I don't think we could say the Menashe ben Israel directly influenced. What I'm trying to point out is by him actually making this an emphasis in his life that the teachings of the Torah are not just something for me to keep to myself, but rather to share with all those around me. And in his instance, he dabbled in political circles and in academic circles. Therefore, he had influence in those fields, which then trickled down into many of the things that we know of till today. So I just found that very fascinating. One of the reasons that I find that fascinating is because we tend to think of our own lives, right? And we think of ourselves as like, I'm a Jew, and then I'm I don't know, whatever. I'm an engineer, or I'm a lawyer. And those two things are not necessarily influencing each other. And I think it behooves us to understand that often with the wisdom that we know from the Torah, we can influence those around us to be more moral and more ethical and more upstanding citizens. That's it. I just want to point that out. I mentioned that he also had a lot to do with Rembrandt. There are 4 etchings. Oh, yes. There is a famous painting from Rembrandt of the scene of Belshazzar's palace. Has anybody, Belshazzar's feast with the writing on the wall? Anybody familiar with this painting? Okay. If you take a look at it, you notice that the Hebrew letters are in the exact sequence that Rabbi Menashe puts them down in one of his works, which has led many scholars to say that perhaps Rembrandt communicated with him and collaborated with him over this. Whether he did or didn't is a different discussion. Definitely there are 4 etchings. You can see them on page 74, figure 2.4. There are 4 etchings by Rembrandt that decorate one of Rabbi Menashe's Spanish language works, devoted to explaining the prophecies of Daniel, or Daniel, the prophet, and explaining the place that righteous Noahide law observant non-Jews have in the world to come. Right? In other words, that righteous among the Gentiles also have a portion of the world to come, which again we discussed last week. And you can kind of see those paintings here on page 74. There is another publication. Oh, yes, I forgot about this. Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael also used his talents in connection with non-Jewish intellectuals to try and benefit the Jewish people materially as well. In other words, their physical survival. The Jews were expelled from England, Danny, in what year? Later than 11? No. 1290. And for over 350 years, it was illegal for Jews to live in England. Okay, in 1652, Rabbi Menashe turned his attention to England, thinking, now it's time. The world is kind of coming out, and there's liberalism and all this sort of thing. And he writes perhaps his most influential work, which is called Mikveh Yisrael, The Hope of Israel, arguing for the readmission of the Jews to England. The time was opportune. England had just rid itself of its king and established a new republic in its place, which was headed by Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell was favorably disposed towards the Jews, and he personally invited Rabbi Menashe to come to England in 1655 and advocate for the readmission of the Jews into England. This was during the Whitehall Conference, which was convened by Cromwell, which was going to debate this matter. Rabbi Menashe issued and published another publication, this time in English, his first English publication, addressed to Cromwell, presenting his arguments. You can see it on page 75. And the English Parliament didn't reach an official resolution. Rabbi Menashe remained in England for 2 more years, continuing to lobby on behalf of the Jewish people and for their readmission into England. In 1657, Rabbi Menashe's last surviving son died. And while transporting his body to the Netherlands for burial, Rabbi Menashe himself died. Which means that Rabbi Menashe died a broken man, thinking that he was disappointed in that he actually didn't manage to readmit the Jewish people, or whatever, to accomplish the readmission of the Jewish people into England. But actually, history has proven, and you can see his gravesite on page 75, actually history has proven that Rabbi Menashe's influence actually was much more influential than he realized. Thanks in a large degree to his efforts, Oliver Cromwell allowed Jews to settle under the radar for many, many years, unofficially, and the Jewish presence in England grew gradually, and it became fully accepted and influential as part of English society. It took a while until that was accepted and recognized, etc. But the effects of what he did actually were almost immediate. It's just that he didn't live. He didn't live to actually see them. And I think this concludes probably one of the most fascinating Jews that I've ever heard of. And to Tova Jane's point, a Jew who not only passively, just by being a Torah observant Jew and being a mensch, that's often what people say. What does it mean to be a light unto the nations? You go be a lawyer, you go be a doctor, and just be a Jew, wear it proudly, let people know that you're a good doctor because you're Jewish, that you're an ethical doctor because you're Jewish, and then they'll learn on their own, and you'll be a light unto the nations on your own. Here you have a Jew who actually actively engaged in this in terms of trying to spread the light of the Torah to the non-Jewish world, which I think is very, very fascinating. Now, we have 10 minutes left. We're going to introduce now, actually, probably our second to most famous character from the 12 characters, which is Rabbi Ovadia Seforno. The reason for that is because Seforno is one of the commentary on the Torah. And if you open up a Chumash, not just a standard one that has Rashi and Onkelos, the two characters that we're most familiar with, but if you open up one that has a few more, Seforno will probably be among them. He's born, we're going back now, to circa 1475. He's born in northern Italy, and it seems that his ancestors had fled Spain a century earlier after the 1391 wave of anti-Semitic pogroms. Unfortunately, many Jews did not see the writing on the wall, and then they stayed for the whole period of the Inquisition, etc. But he actually fled, his family fled. And in 1475, or roughly thereabouts, Ovadia Seforno is born in Italy. Now, we don't know much about Rabbi Ovadia's youth. We can assume that he studied with his father, because his father was a well-known Talmudic scholar at the time. We could also assume that he would have studied Torah and Talmud, but also that at the same time he would have studied mathematics, philosophy, and linguistics. This is just based on what was being done in northern Italy at the time. He went to medical school, and he became a doctor, in a city called Ferrara, Italy, where he received his doctorate in 1501. All right. He lived the next period of his life in Rome, where he was a prominent figure of the Jewish community, and after Rome was ravaged by war in 1527, Seforno lived the rest of his life in a little city called Bologna, Italy. People familiar with Bologna? My brother-in-law is from Bologna, so that's why I'm familiar with this. And on page 76, you can see, I haven't been there, and I went around Italy, but I did not make it to Bologna. But you can see Casa Seforno, which is a house that supposedly the Seforno family lived in at some point or another. Now, as I mentioned, Seforno is mainly known for his commentary on the Chumash. But I want to talk about a different aspect, and you can see that on page 77, figure 2.8. This is some of the, it looks like it's a page from a draft of his okay, beautiful. But I want to talk about a different aspect, which is that Seforno actually had a relationship with a famous non-Jew, okay? And one of my favorite aspects of this story, I mentioned to some of you that this morning I had the privilege of sitting at a meeting with APAC, with a representative of APAC from Washington, D.C. They were here. They were trying to recruit funding from Jews here in Pasadena. And it was at a friend of mine's office. And one of the questions that I asked them was, and I was happy to receive an affirmative answer, was, is there any work that's being done with those? Because I understand that they're taking, what's his name, Mike Pompeo to Israel. Right? Beautiful. That's wonderful. And perhaps they can even lay claim to some sort of role that he's pro-Israel because of that. Maybe they took him when he was younger, and they're taking other congressmen in order to try and get people to see Israel and to become pro-Israel. Beautiful. But my question to them, and this is probably the only question I asked at the meeting, was, are you guys doing any work? Not in terms of taking anti-Semites and turning them into loving Jews that you'll hug and kiss, etc., but in terms of trying to change hearts and minds that people can actually understand a little bit more of a broader picture. To people who perhaps were, so to speak, brainwashed or only told one side of the story, etc., are you doing your best to reach out to them? Because those are the people that you think are the hopeless cases, right? For example, members of the Squad. Anybody familiar with the Squad, right? The Squad, right? These are some of the most rabid anti-Semites in Congress today. But I don't believe that we should just write them off as anti-Semitic. I believe when we do that, we completely close off the walls. We're closing off the doors to any. And actually, sometimes a tiny drop of influence on one of them could be worth much more than a tremendous amount of influence on somebody who's already neutral on Israel, or perhaps even pro-Israel to one degree or another, and you're making them even more pro-Israel. A tiny drop of influence on someone like that could actually be more. And that is the story of Ovadia Seforno through his Torah education, and specifically in his studies with a man whose name was Johannes Reuchlin. The rest of this story is going to be told via video, mainly for lack of time. I had planned to read the texts, which are texts 12, 13, and 14. Essentially what happened, the broad strokes of the story are that, raise your hand if you were at the previous course, the Talmud course, the Decoding the Talmud course. You remember the story of the public burning of the Talmud and just how terrible that was for the Jewish people. This was another almost such situation. As we know, when it comes to the Jewish people, our physical survival is one aspect, but even if we're made to flee from one place to another, the Jewish people have always survived through their study of Torah. And one of the things that was happening in Italy at the time, under the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century, you can see it on page 78, is that there was not just the beginnings of a decree, there was an actual decree, and there was even confiscation, excuse me, of much of the Talmudic books of the Jewish people at the time. And Johannes Reuchlin, going back to his education with Ovadia Seforno, actually manages to intercede on behalf of the Jewish people. The person I'm going to bring up on the screen is impressive because he's a religious Jew and he's also a PhD and an expert in this particular topic, but unfortunately he's not very dynamic. But I think that the story... I like you. You like me? Thank you. Thank you. No, I'm talking about the person on the screen. But he does give us a very, very authoritative account of the relationship between Rabbi Ovadia Seforno and Johannes Reuchlin. So please turn your attention to the video screens for this particular, hold on. Should be coming. Here we go.
Johannes Reuchlin was a German diplomat and a great intellectual. He studied Hebrew when he was still in Germany. He learned with a rabbi called Yechiel Loans in Frederick II's court. He was a physician there. And later he was sent on a diplomatic mission in 1498 to Rome. And while he was there, he turned to Seforno to ask him to teach him. What he taught him was subject to much dispute and much discussion by academics. The truth about it is certainly what Saverio Campanini, who's a great professor in the field, who checked Reuchlin's books, and what he came up with was that Seforno probably taught Moreh Nevuchim, the Maimonides guides. Reuchlin was interested in Judaic studies, first of all because the idea was at the time that truth lies in various places of ancient wisdom, and especially as Judaism is the source for all other monotheistic religions. So the war against the Jewish book goes back to the early years of Christianity. Most famous was in the Middle Ages the burning of the Talmud in Paris, which actually brought to the end the Jewish community in France, because once you have no books, once you have no Talmud, so you don't have any study, and you don't have any rabbis, and everyone who knew anything about the Jewish religion had to leave to other places to be able to study. The problem of Christians with the Talmud is because they understand that the Talmud is a source of strength to the Jewish nation, but they would also say that that's the reason that the Jews don't recognize the truth of Christianity. So they often tried to wage war against the Talmud, and in Germany, following the acclamations of a Jewish apostate who was actually a petty criminal who, to save his skin, became Christian and then decided that he was a big rabbi and he understands in the Talmud Johannes Pfefferkorn, so as two Johannes fighting one against each other. And that's where Johannes Reuchlin came out with all his might and all his knowledge to save the Talmud from being burning in Germany. Right at the beginning of the book affair, the books of the Jewish community in Frankfurt were taken in custody by the church, and there was a committee that was supposed to verify the claims that the Talmud contains something against Christianity. At this point, Pfefferkorn, who was the instigator, wrote a book proving as if the Talmud contains a lot of blasphemy against Christianity and against the founder of Christianity. And Johannes Reuchlin did something which at the time was a very, very brazen act, and he actually printed a book against Pfefferkorn's book, which was countering the claims of Pfefferkorn and trying also to prove that Pfefferkorn was an absolute ignorant who didn't even know the Talmud. It actually carried on going back and forth for some years. The Pope at the beginning did not get involved, and then when he actually did get involved, and there was another committee, and eventually Reuchlin was part of the committee, was supposed to give the final verdict, and he was actually the only one who understood Hebrew in that committee, but he stood firm, he stood his ground, though he was going through a lot of persecution, which brought to his early death, but eventually the decree was rescinded, and the books in Germany were not burnt. Reuchlin cannot be called a Jew lover, though he respected Jews that had knowledge and could help him with their knowledge, and he wasn't a rabid anti-Semite, but he was still a man of his time, which usually European at the time would not be, cannot be accused of loving Jews, but he understood that the science of the Talmud and of general Jewish knowledge contains a lot of truths. A few times when they were speaking about expulsions of Jews from Germany or from Italy, Reuchlin spoke out very strong against it, stating that if no one here will know Hebrew, all those truths will be lost. So it wasn't really the Jews that he was trying to save, but their books, but he viewed the Jews as the keepers of those books and that knowledge. And he understood also that lots of that knowledge was oral knowledge, which could not be it was not committed to writing. So that's the reason that he saw it as so important to save the Talmud and to save actually the Jews also from being expelled from Europe.
To me, this is a fascinating story, but it's not just to me, actually to contemporary historians at the time, and one of the most well-known contemporary historians at the time was a man by the name of Yosselman, or Rabbi Yosselman of Roshheim, because he wrote a journal, literally chronicling everything that was going on at that time, and he actually tells this story very briefly. Steve, if you can read it on page text 15, where he talks about this story and just what a miracle it was that a non-Jew, not a Jew, a non-Jew should put his life on the line, or whatever, his career on the line, and really stick his neck out for the Jewish people. Perhaps not even a lover of the Jews. Go ahead, text 15.
Okay, in the year 1510, enemies and renegades rose up against our people, seeking to destroy our Torah books. God showed us a miracle within a miracle, as non-Jewish scholars countered our oppressors and returned the Torah books to their former glory.
Thank you. On page 81, you can also see the title page of Rabbi Ovadia Sforno's book, which is called Lumen Gentium. It's written in Latin, and in Hebrew it would be called Or Amim, or the light unto the nations, literally. He wrote a book addressed to non-Jews, which I think is a fascinating concept. With this, we'll conclude the story of the third of our influential Jews, Rabbi Ovadia Seforno, who influenced Johannes Reuchlin to be, and eventually to be a prominent supporter of Judaism in Germany and literally saved many, many Jews. What I find fascinating about the story of Ovadia Seforno's relationship is that I don't think he was aware at the time that Johannes Reuchlin would go on to play such a major role. He was just preaching truth. Somebody came to him looking for truth, so he provided the Torah's version of truth to this particular person. In other words, the Torah's truth for version of truth for non-Jews to this particular non-Jew, and then eventually goes on to play a very, very crucial role in terms of Jewish survival. I want to conclude by reading text 16, which I think really, it's from Ovadia Seforno, that's why I want to read it. It's from his commentary to Exodus, to a verse which says, "Atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim, and you shall be for me a kingdom of priests." Rabbi Seforno writes the following. Greka, can you read for us, please? Page 83.
You shall be to me a kingdom of priests. You will be a unique treasure to me in the sense that you will be a kingdom of priests whose mission is to guide and teach their child in ways, to serve upon the name of God and to serve him with one purpose.
And I think that's where I'd like to conclude today's lesson. We're going to conclude with a video, but the reason I want to conclude with this text is because I think this text is kind of a call to action. It's kind of turning to every single one of us. You might not be Ovadia Seforno. You might certainly not be Menashe ben Israel, right, or a military general or advisor to the king like the Shmuel HaNagid. But every single one of us interacts with non-Jews every single day, to one degree or another. Right? Even myself, right? Even though I hang out in the Jewish world, I'm a rabbi, but I interact with non-Jews all the time. And we have a responsibility to figure out how we can play our role in being a light unto the nations and spreading the word of the Torah to the non-Jews of the world. So I'm going to play for you now a 3-4 minute clip of the Rebbe talking about this topic. Somebody mentioned that the Rebbe might be considered one of the biggest influences in that way. And it's probably true, by the way, because the Rebbe often had his talks advertised on television. You can see a marked difference between the way the Rebbe would talk when he was talking to the crowd in 770 and when he knew that his talks were televised. The Rebbe would talk to the entire world, not just to the Jewish world, but to the entire world. And my exercise for you on page 83 is to try, while the Rebbe is talking, to think and envision for yourself how you yourself can be a light unto the nations in your own life. So please turn your attention to the video screens for the video of the Rebbe.
Der Linie von Losheves Yitzora, und das ist der Chayinja Nikri in Bris Oelam, Leilo Tehu Bro, Losheves Yitzora, Yishu Oelam, und das ist die Nekude von der Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Neach, wo der Funde ist echt verstandig, aber das ist echt Kelo der Mitzvah von Dinim, am Aspir gewesen, auf andere B'nai Neach, als soll nechet Mekayim sein, der Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Neach, mit alle Seele Sifim und Snifim, וכאומר, ודוס דחכת נסתבו, בשעה סמטן תירה ודמות die Bottel geworden, die Gseira, ואני המסחיל, und demult hat der Rebischter, was gewähnt der Maschil, hat angesagt ihnen, und gegeben sie Keach, als sie sollen auftan, bechol boye Elam, auf Mekayim sein, der Mitzvahs die Lehu, wo das nicht sam Mitzvah die Dhu, nur das der Ringen von Yesheves Yitzora, ist davon verstandig der Gedel Hoinien, was Schar, was mit Bakum der Fahr, was in Drupe der Klal, an Zena Kodesh Baruch und der Kapeich Schar Kol Berje, Allahas kamen von Anodem, Shenivra Bezellen, davon echt verstandig, wenn geht zu Stadtlust von Iden, in sie geben zu gewissen, wegen unter die alle in Jonen, die zwischen sie, was bis ist, wissen sie noch nicht, bis Schleimus, oder sie wissen noch nicht, gar nicht bei sie, und die, was sie haben, a Keres aber Kontschaft, mit a höheren Kreis, konnten nicht jeder sein, der mit, was sagt, mit Stadl bei sie, mit Dibne Neich, was leben bis Chonosse, wie Kajetse Bose, nur darf ausnutzen seine Verbindungen, wie Schleimusa, und befragt noch, ob das Gefinzach und die Verbindung ist, mit der Sehne, was sie haben, Spur, al kama bnei Neach, und wie bald der Sehne mewake Schäbel Fikechom, ist auch eine sichere Sache, am Gitwe Mechit Keach, soll Peil sein, mit die, was gefunden sich bei ihr hat Bira, oder in Name Kem und Name Matze von Bira, vachulu. Bischaas Iden haben auf drauf nicht gehabt, kein Keach, haben sie echt nicht gehabt, die Möglichkeit, mir bei Meila bin der Chateva. Muss sie auch geschlossen in Magetta, wie Kajese Base. Und so haben die gehabt, kein Magu und Massa, Allachas Kama wie Kama, Hashpo, Afame Hore, Chemisviva. Hat man gesehen, bei Pashtus, als für die Jorn und für die letzte paar Deles, ich geworden als Ami Maimed und Massa, als ich geworden als Magu und Massa, zwischen Iden und Nicht-Iden, nicht wie sie geworden liefen, ist ins Mama Golus, je mehr haben Nein wie Kajese Base, schlägt beherrach an längerer und an mehr Verbundener. Und wie Koomur, wie bald als sie gegeben geworden, die Möglichkeit, fällt mehr nie, beloschen Rambam oder Schuss, weil Jecheles, in die Sunne, lechol Echad ve Echad, bedarf nur Wellen und ohne im Tonnen dem bis be Meise bepei. Wo Schleimus Kolo Eilam Kule jedoch verbunden, der Miet, was Ekral Kol Hamim Kulem Sofa Bruro, Liovdi Kulem Schem Echad, wo demol darf gebohäusel Hawaii Hamlucha, wie der Rambam bringt es herauf, in Sifri Halochis Halochis, und in Hilchis in Mesa Moschiach, ki medubar kama pomim, i das Negea, der Hachonela se, wo der Hachonela se, der Ekral Kol Hamim, so Lufton Pulose, und bis Riesus, wie Teke Fumiyad, darf man doch haben Hachone Massimo, wo das bepasst, seche die Chayim, mit Kiyum, mit Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Neir Dilhu, macht sie Muchscher, auf Mekabel sein und Kehli sein und der Iker Mekayim sein, die Kriya, bisha sie kommt, Teke vom Yad Mamash, wo demult ist Teke vom Yad Mamash, wo Oisel Havaya am Luch.
I think the Rebbe's point is well taken, that we find ourselves at a time when we do have positive relations with those around us. We don't live in a ghetto. We're not being persecuted by those non-Jews around us, thank God, at least not here in the United States. And it behooves us to figure out ways that we can serve as a light unto the nations to all those around us. Please turn your attention to the video screen for a summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 2. Influential Jews. Narratives. 1. Rabbi Shmuel Hanagid was the leading Talmudic scholar in Spain in the first half of the 11th century. He had extensive secular knowledge and was a talented linguist and poet. His unique combination of talents saw him rise to serve as the leader of the Jewish community of Granada and the chief advisor and military commander for the Berber Muslim king. His combination of Talmudic and military excellence made him a unique figure in Jewish history, inspiring both his contemporaries and future generations. 2. Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael was born in 17th century Portugal to a family that had secretly maintained Jewish practice for over 100 years after their forced conversion. After his father was tortured by the Inquisition for his Jewish observance, the family fled to Amsterdam, where they openly embraced their Judaism. Rabbi Menashe devoted his life to communicating Jewish wisdom and moral guidance to the non-Jewish world. Through his many published works and personal relationships with influential figures such as Rembrandt and political philosopher Hugo Grotius, Rabbi Menashe strongly impacted European intellectual development and advanced the material interests of his Jewish brethren. 3. Rabbi Ovadia Sforno was an Italian 15th-16th century Bible commentator and philosopher. His relationship with German humanist scholar Johann Reuchlin helped inspire Reuchlin's lifelong advocacy on behalf of the Jewish people and their scholarship. General points. 1. The Jewish people are charged with the mission of serving as a light unto the nations. The light we are tasked with spreading is specifically the light of Torah and its universal moral guidance. 2. Judaism has a universal message for all humans, encapsulated in the 7 Noahide laws. Throughout the majority of Jewish history, Jews were severely restricted in their ability to be a light unto the nations and to thereby positively influence the world. The freedoms we enjoy in the modern era present us with a unique opportunity to live up to our calling.
Thank you all for joining us for Lesson 2. This has been Influential Jews. I look forward to seeing you all next week for Lesson 3, Unsung Heroines, when we'll talk about the Jewish female stars of the show. Thank you all for joining us.